On October 23rd, the ongoing suspension of U.S. federal government funding reached 23 days. This makes the current shutdown the second longest in modern history, surpassing the 21-day government shutdown in 1995-1996 during Bill Clinton's administration. It is still far from the absolute record. The longest budget crisis lasted 35 days in 2018-2019, during Donald Trump's first term as U.S. president. And although there is still some way to go before the absolute record is broken, there are no signs of a quick resolution. Representatives of the Republican and Democratic parties continue to shift responsibility onto each other, and negotiations have reached an impasse. Tension is mounting in Washington. Each new day of funding stoppage increases pressure on both politicians and ordinary citizens who are directly affected by the consequences of the budget blockage. The reason for the protracted shutdown is a dispute over healthcare and the budget. Democrats are demanding that the reopening of the government be linked to the extension of ACA, Obamacare subsidies, and other benefits that expire on December 31st. Without this, they warn, insurance premiums for millions will rise, and the start of open enrollment for policies on November 1st will take place amid price shocks. Republicans insist on resuming funding first and then discussing healthcare policy separately. The House of Representatives passed a temporary bill until November 21st without conditions on healthcare, but it failed again in the Senate. 60 votes are needed to pass it, and there are not enough Democrats who support clean funding. As a result, the budget is blocked precisely at the junction of two approaches: open first, then argue, versus agree on benefits first, then open. The party standoff has clearly gone too far. As of October 20th, senators had already put the temporary budget bill to a vote 11 times, and each time without success. Only 3 moderate Democratic senators, including John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, began voting with the Republicans, but this is not enough. At least 5 more votes are needed to pass the bill. A 12th attempt to vote on open government was scheduled for October 22nd, but as expected, it failed again. The situation has become absurd. The Senate repeats the same scenario day after day, while the federal government remains paralyzed. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives is virtually inactive. The Republican majority in the lower house, having sent its proposal to the Senate, has effectively left Washington for the holidays, waiting for the senators to take action. Democrats sharply criticize their colleagues in the House for such inaction. Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries called what is happening the Trump and Republican shutdown, and stressed that because of party games, every day ordinary Americans suffer. According to him, conservatives are fully responsible for the paralysis of the government, as they refuse to find a compromise on the budget in time. Republicans, for their part, call the current situation Schumer's shutdown, after the name of the Democratic leader, claiming that it is the opposition that is to blame for the government shutdown. Political leaders are exchanging increasingly harsh statements. President Donald Trump has firmly sided with his fellow Republicans. On October 21st, he summoned Republican senators to the White House and publicly stated that he would not allow Democrats to blackmail the country with their insane demands. Trump refuses to meet with Democratic leaders for direct negotiations until funding is restored. In his words, "We will not allow ourselves and the country to be blackmailed." In response, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer called on the president to immediately sit down at the negotiating table and warned that every day the situation for ordinary Americans is getting worse. Schumer and the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives again requested a meeting with the president before his departure abroad, but were refused. Meanwhile, on October 24th, the president plans to embark on a multi-day trip abroad, including participation in the APEC summit in South Korea and a meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. By flying away in the midst of the budget crisis, Trump is making it clear that he does not intend to change his position, at least until he returns home. This move has drawn criticism from the opposition. Democrats point out that the president is leaving the country, leaving hundreds of thousands of Americans hostage to the budget crisis. In their opinion, instead of foreign visits, the head of state should first and foremost focus on unblocking the government. However, supporters of the administration respond that international commitments cannot wait, and the fact of the shutdown should not paralyze U.S. foreign policy. For millions of federal employees, the protracted shutdown is resulting in direct financial losses. Many agencies have suspended operations, and about 750,000 of the 2 million federal employees have been sent on forced unpaid leave for an indefinite period. About 1 million employees whose work is considered critical to protecting life and safety, including military personnel, law enforcement officers, border guards, and air traffic controllers, continue to report to work. but without guaranteed pay until funding is restored. Each day brings growing stress for the families of government employees, who are forced to dip into their savings and put off paying bills while they wait for the budget crisis to end. At first, the consequences of non-payment of salaries were not immediately apparent. On October 10th, many federal employees still received partial payments. In fact, only for the first days of the last working period in September, before the budget shutdown. However, the next milestone, October 24th, will be a turning point. By that date, a full 2-week period will have elapsed, falling entirely within the shutdown period, and the government will not be able to transfer salaries for those 2 weeks. Simply put, thousands of people will discover this Friday that their long-awaited paychecks have not been deposited into their accounts. The country's leadership has tried to mitigate the situation, at least for the military. On October 15th, the administration found a legal way to transfer funds in the budget to pay military personnel despite the shutdown. However, civilian employees remain without pay. According to estimates by the Bipartisan Policy Center, if the government shutdown continues until the end of October, more than 1.8 million paychecks will not be issued to civilian employees of federal agencies. This figure includes payments scheduled for October 24th, 28th, and 30, all of which will be delayed indefinitely. The prospect of missing even one full paycheck is forcing many workers to cut their spending to a minimum. On a household level, this means postponed purchases, difficulties in paying off loans and mortgages, and an increase in account balances. Federal unions are already sounding the alarm. The families of ordinary employees cannot live long without income, and each new day of government downtime puts them in an increasingly vulnerable position. Many are wondering, is it worth staying in public service amid such instability? Repeated budget crises undermine employee morale and could lead to an exodus of personnel from federal agencies. In the past, Congress has passed special legislation to retroactively compensate for unpaid wages after a shutdown, but it is unclear when this compensation will actually arrive. In addition, over time, travel and other allowances are often not covered, which also hits employees' pockets. The longer the funding stoppage lasts, the more pronounced its side effects on the life of the country become. For example, civil aviation is already facing difficulties, although air traffic controllers and airport security personnel continue to perform their duties as essential personnel. They are doing so without pay. As a result, the risk of disruptions is growing, with reports of an increasing number of flight delays due to staff shortages and worker fatigue. In 2019, during the previous prolonged shutdown, it was problems in the aviation industry that forced politicians to compromise. The situation could repeat itself this fall if key aviation employees continue to work without pay. Other areas are also suffering. National parks and museums are forced to cut back on visitor services. Cleaning, visitor center operations, and tours have been suspended or limited. Most parks remain open, thanks to the administration seeking alternative funding and enlisting volunteer help. But without money, this cannot last forever. With each day without a budget, the condition of the parks deteriorates, trash accumulates, visitors are deprived of the usual services, and some travelers cancel their planned trips altogether. Tourism industry representatives note that families who have been saving money for years to visit national parks are now forced to cancel those plans due to the shutdown. Another worrying area is social support programs. The Federal Food Assistance Program for low-income families, known as SNAP or food stamps, and a special program for women with children, in WIC, may begin to cut benefits if funding is not restored soon. Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman noted that food program funds are nearly depleted, and if the crisis does not end, tens of millions of Americans risk being left without the necessary food assistance. In addition, some government subsidies to farmers, housing programs, education and research grants are facing funding delays, all of which are gradually being frozen until Congress unblocks the budget. Many federal agencies are closed or operating with minimal staff. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, has suspended routine inspections and even responses to some environmental emergencies. The National Archives has suspended the issuance of copies of documents, and NASA has furloughed a significant portion of its staff, threatening delays in scientific research and the preparation of space missions. Ministries responsible for economic support to citizens, such as the Department of Housing and Urban Development, are unable to allocate grants for affordable housing or issue low-interest loans to small businesses in a timely manner. Despite the scale of the crisis, a number of vital government functions are still being performed. For example, the payment of pensions and Social Security benefits is carried out as usual. These programs are funded automatically and do not depend on annual budget allocations. The Postal Service, USPS, also operates without interruption, as it does not receive funds from the federal budget, but is financed from its own revenues. These factors help soften the blow to the population. Pensioners receive their checks, and letters and parcels are delivered. However, other government agencies, from issuing licenses and passports to the work of federal courts, are feeling the effects of the shutdown. The judicial system, for example, has already cut back on civil cases, postponing less urgent hearings, although criminal justice continues unabated. Economists warn that a prolonged shutdown is negatively affecting the country's economy as a whole. Every day that government agencies are shut down means lost services and lost productivity. Private companies working on government contracts are also suffering. Projects are on hold, bills are not being paid, and small businesses in the capital region and other areas that depend on federal contracts or government customers are suffering losses. Experts estimate that such funding gaps cost the U.S. economy billions of dollars. For example, after the 35-day shutdown in 2018-2019, Congress estimated the direct loss of GDP at approximately $3 billion, not counting delayed effects. And the 16-day government shutdown in 2013, according to S&P analysts' calculations, cost the economy about $24 billion. The continuing crisis threatens to undermine confidence in the financial stability of the United States. International investors and rating agencies are closely monitoring the situation. Repeated budget deadlocks and threats of default have already led to a downgrade of the country's credit rating. In the summer of 2023, Fitch stripped the U.S. of its highest rating, citing erosion of governance, constant political crises such as shutdowns and threats of default. If the government remains partially shut down for a long time, this could affect financial markets, from stock market volatility to higher borrowing costs for the government. These risks remain theoretical for now, but each new shutdown record brings them closer to reality. At the moment, there is no concrete plan for a quick end to the shutdown. Both parties have taken tough positions and are unwilling to compromise on their principles. Many observers fear that the crisis could drag on for a long time, even setting a new record for duration. If funding is not restored in the next 2 weeks, the current government shutdown will break the 35-day record set in 2018 and 2019 and become the longest in U.S. history. There is a growing understanding among lawmakers that a compromise is needed. Informal negotiations between individual members of Congress are continuing, although publicly the parties are maintaining their tough rhetoric. Some politicians are proposing unconventional measures. For example, Democratic Senator John Fetterman has called for the temporary suspension of the 60-vote rule in the Senate, which allows a minority to block the budget. In his opinion, an exception should be made to the filibuster procedure in order to pass funding by a simple majority. However, Senate leadership, including Republican leader John Thune, rejects the idea of changing the rules for the sake of the current situation, fearing it would set a precedent. Instead, Republicans are looking for ways to increase pressure on Democrats. They also face a practical question: what to do with the proposed term of the new temporary budget? November 21st, the date by which funding was supposed to be extended in the original bill, is just around the corner. Even if Democrats suddenly agree to unblock the budget, Congress may have to pass another extension resolution almost immediately to avoid another shutdown in a couple of weeks. This calendar paradox complicates the search for a solution. Some experts believe that public discontent could be the key factor in ending the crisis. The more tangible the consequences of the shutdown are for ordinary citizens, flight delays, suspension of support program payments, threats to the healthcare system, the greater the pressure on politicians. Polls already show that most Americans are extremely dissatisfied with the situation and consider it unacceptable. Politicians in Washington understand this and fear that their party will be held responsible for the damage caused. The history of previous government shutdowns shows that when the negative effects reach a critical point, Congress and the White House make concessions in order to resume the work of federal agencies. So far, on the 23rd day of the crisis, that point has not yet been reached. Americans can only hope that common sense will prevail and that leaders in Washington will be able to find a compromise before the situation spirals completely out of control. At stake are not only the salaries of officials or party ambitions, the stability of the economy and the well-being of millions of citizens who depend on the normal functioning of the government are under threat. With each new day of downtime, the price of inaction rises, and the time allotted for political games is rapidly running out. The main test lies ahead. Who will give in first and what will have to be included in the agreement to to finally get the government up and running and end the crisis. In the coming days, it will become clear whether lawmakers will be able to overcome their differences or whether the country will approach a new, undesirable record for the length of the shutdown.